Hello, Christian, and thank you so much for being a part of our You Flourish podcast. I'm so excited that we can take this time today. You have such an incredible story, and I just know that our listeners are going to really love hearing how throughout your journey you've really stayed relentless in your faith, even through the challenges and the different things that you've gone through. And so I kind of want to just jump right in from the beginning and just have you start off by telling us about your upbringing and your faith story.
Yeah, no, Kelsey, thank you so much for having me here. I've been really looking forward to this conversation and yeah, excited just to jump right into it. My upbringing is a little bit unusual, maybe a little different than what some might expect. But just to kind of take you way back to the beginning, I'm actually adopted. That adoption actually plays really heavily into the story, as I hope we'll see later on. But when I was between the ages of 2 and 3, my birth parents, they had a lot of struggles, a lot of just personal issues, and due to circumstances, the decision was made to actually put me up for adoption in the foster care system. I had other siblings at the time, but I was just a little bit more than what family could handle. And so at about the age of 2-ish, 3, I was put in the foster care system. And so being that old, I actually do have memories of that time frame of just moving from foster home to foster home, moving from caretaker family to caretaker family. And when I was about 3 and a half, I was blessed with my parents who came and adopted me. But as you can imagine, being that old and having a personality, having memories, having interactions, I really struggled for a very long time because I didn't know why I couldn't find a home. I didn't know why the families that were taking care of me didn't want me. I thought there was something wrong. And actually, for years after being adopted, anytime I messed up, as any kid would, spill the milk or, maybe do something just not quite exactly right, not even getting in trouble, just not doing something perfectly, I thought that I would be sent back. I didn't quite understand the idea of love. I didn't quite understand the idea of that love is unconditional. And my family, my parents, they brought me up in a Christian home, right? They took me to church every Sunday. And I actually came to see my father come to Christ before I came to saving faith. But in all of these experiences, I came to bring into my relationship with God this idea of if I sinned, God wouldn't love me. And so I ended up having conversations with my mom of just like, mom, every night, I'm asking God to save me again and save me again, right? Because I sinned. And at some point she was like, this is too much for me to handle, and had me sit down with our pastor. I was like, here, explain this to him. And the pastor, sat down with me and walked me through the Romans road, the salvation story. I mean, I was 8 years old, and he had to explain to me like, okay, like this is a one and done situation. If God is calling you and you accept his free gift of salvation, it actually, you can't do anything to jeopardize that. And I was like, okay. And he was like, so, like, are you ready to make that decision? And I was like, yeah. And so when I was 8 years old, I put my faith in Jesus. And it was at that moment that I consider my salvation story to have occurred. That didn't mean that I stopped struggling with this idea of being wanted or being accepted. I always kind of felt a little bit like an outcast. I didn't quite know how to relate to individuals or friends or peers. And then when I was about 14, 13 actually, my parents felt the call to go overseas to be missionaries. And if you're not familiar with that, most of the time when you go overseas, you have to take a certain amount of time off to do language and culture learning. And my parents, I was homeschooled, and they looked at me and said, okay, well, you've gotten bored over summer vacations, you just continue to work, you're kind of ahead of your peers here. Let's go ahead and have you, see if you can graduate high school, get your high school diploma. And that way, if you take a couple years off to do language and cultural learning, you'll be right where you should be, right? You'll come back, you'll be, right where you should be. So I took this exam, passed, got my high school diploma at 14, and that was 2008 when the economy crashed. And my parents being faith-supported missionaries, nobody was able to help support them to go overseas. And so we ended up staying stateside. And my parents looked at me and said, "Hey, we have a 14-year-old high school graduate. We can't just have him sitting on the couch all day." So they took me down and enrolled me in community college. And so at 14, I started community college and went in, did a whole undergrad in computer engineering, and ended up minoring in a program called Global Intelligence and National Security, which then played into my ultimate career move right after college. So the first 19, 20 years of my life were really characterized by trying to learn what it means to be accepted, what it means to be loved. Even when I met my wonderful wife, she's had to continually remind me that she's going to keep me, because there's I'm not a perfect husband. And I've had to work to come to this idea, this acceptance of God's free gift of grace, and salvation, and that's not because of anything that I've done, but because He wanted to adopt me into His family. Oh.
Well, Christian, I got goosebumps when you were just talking about your story and your upbringing, and I can't imagine what that would have felt like, especially as a 2.5 or 3-year-old child, to feel like nobody wanted you and to feel like you didn't have a place that you could call home. I know you and I, right away when we first connected, we connected over the fact that we both have a little girl. I know yours,
Yeah.
Arabella, is 5.5-ish months old.
Yeah. Getting big.
How are you channeling your experiences now being a new dad? What has that done for you now being in that role?
Yeah. I'm still trying to come to I wouldn't say come to grips with, but I'm still coming to like an identity shift, right? That I am now a father. And one thing that's really cool, being adopted and not really knowing too much at all about my birth family. My daughter is the first human that I know of who is physically related to me. It's kind of a wild thought that this is somebody who's actually of me. And I hope that she's never going to have to feel at all the out of place feelings that I felt. But also I'm trying to come to terms with the fact that I am now a father, and how do I emulate being the kind of father that God is to us? Much like Christ or the church is the bride of Christ, right? And within my marriage relationship, I am supposed to exhibit Christ-like behaviors to be an example to my wife. It's now a mindset shift of not only am I the husband of my wife, but I am now the father to my daughter. And it's an awesome responsibility to realize the weight that carries. So I don't know if that quite answers your question, but it's something that I'm having to learn every day, every week, of how do I exhibit these characteristics of fatherly love to my daughter. And yeah.
Well, I think that the fuel that you must feel from not having always feeling that love and not having a stable home, especially at those early years of your life, I just can't imagine. I mean, I think about how much joy that my daughter brings me and how happy I am to have her in my life, but it's just a whole nother level to think about. This is your first blood relative that you are truly getting to mentor and foster a relationship with God, and how rewarding that must feel for you, to be
Yeah.
able to be a parent to her. And so you absolutely answered my question. I just think
Oh,
it's
good.
beautiful, that you're able to, give her a home, and she doesn't have to go through what you did, and just seeing the role model that you are for her. It's just a beautiful thing. So no, I was
Well, thank you.
just curious, because I think becoming a parent really changes us. And I just think that, yeah, that experience of being adopted, and everything that you talked about is just, very, very admirable. Now, you mentioned graduating early, and going off to school. Tell us more about your career path, because you've had quite a, unique and
Yeah.
fascinating career journey as well.
Yes. It's definitely a little bit out of the norm. So I went to school for a computer engineering degree. Graduated with that. And I mentioned that I went through a minor program in global intelligence and national security. And kind of unabashedly, I was markedly influenced by the Jason Bourne movies. So shout out there. At what little boy isn't?
Right.
But my fascination with the Bourne films kind of went far beyond just your average teenager's fascination with being a secret spy, right? I devoured the bonus materials on those films, interviews with like actual people who worked at the CIA, right? And I was like, there's no way that something like this is real, right? You read about programs like MK Ultra and all that, which your listeners and can go look up for themselves. And I was just like, there's no way that something like this works. Well, through my global intelligence national security program at Cal State University Bakersfield, I had the opportunity to go to something called an intelligence simulation. And what this was an event put on by the intelligence community at one of the California state universities, and they had actual CIA officers running the simulation. I couldn't believe it. I was like a kid in a candy store. I was just like, I can't believe I'm shaking your hand, right? You're like, this is the most cool thing ever. And they were running an actual intelligence simulation of a groundbreaking scenario of something that was very dynamic, very fluid. Every 5 minutes, new information was coming about, and we had to figure out what was going on, right, and come up with an actual plan. And I absolutely loved it. And so at the beginning of my senior year, remember I'm 19, or at that point I was 18. I had only just become a actual adult. um, and because up until that point, I couldn't apply for anything. And I said, you know what? I'm going to apply. And so I applied to the Central Intelligence Agencies. At that time, it was called the National Clandestine Service. That eventually got rebranded back into what it historically is known as the Director of Operations. And so at the CIA, there are 4 directorates. You can think of them as more like 4 businesses. You got the Directorate of Operations, the Directorate of Analysis, the Directorate of Science and Technology, and then the Directorate of Digital Innovation. And so what your listeners are most familiar with when you think of the CIA it's the Director of Operations. They're the cool kids. And so when I applied, because of how young I was put into a program called the Professional Trainee Program. And I went through a very lengthy interview process, a very intrusive background investigation. I went through more polygraphs than I'd like to admit, which I hope you and your listeners never have to go through because they're extremely uncomfortable. And at every stage of the interview process, before the interview and after the interview, I prayed and I said, God, if this is the path you want me to walk down, I'm going to walk down it. But if it's not, close this door, take this opportunity away. Don't let me keep going. And I pursued every step of the process out of faith. And ultimately, I got the phone call that said, hey, we'd like to invite you to join our organization. And I couldn't believe it. At 19, I was extended an offer to join the Director of Operations as a professional trainee. And basically, they had me pegged for one of two roles, and this really came down to my personality. Could have either been an operations officer, which is the very pointy tip of the spear. They're the people who are going out and meeting clandestine assets and doing the work of spying, if you think of it. Or I could be what's called a collections management officer. And collections management is essentially quality assurance. They're the people who sit between the ops officers and policymakers. They're the people who take policymakers' questions and turn them into actionable requirements. They're the people who are looking at the intel that's coming in and saying, does this meet criteria or not? And if it doesn't, go back and get more information. And here's how we go about do it. How do we assess somebody to identify what kind of questions they can answer, that sort of thing. They are trained to do the same job as an ops officer, but their primary role is not to be an ops officer. And me, being the inquisitive bookworm that I am, I decided to go the route of a collections management officer. I ended up meeting one of my very close friends who was going to be a guest on your show upcoming. And he was trained as an ops officer, and that's William Cromartie, which I'm sure you guys will have a great conversation. And so that's a long way of saying I went into the CIA. I did that job for about 3.5 years, and then due to some personal circumstances, left that role, leveraged my computer engineering degree, and I have now since become a web hacker for Google now. But I work for Google as part of Mandiant.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your experience in the CIA. I know one of the things that we wanted to discuss was being relentless in your faith. And I know that you mentioned that your experience in the CIA played a big role in this. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So the word relentless, when we talked before, that has become a word that I have tried to capture for my own. And this really came about when I went down for the agency's 6-month residency training program. And so one of the things, if you've dissected any agency lore at all, is they have this location. It's called the farm. And the farm it's an affectionate term, and it's got a whole history there for why it's called the farm. But for my purposes, it was a 6-month residency training program. I left my wife for 6 months, and I was put into a pressure cooker. And that's really the best term that I can come up with for it. It's 6 months of a pressure cooker, where every week pressure gets a little bit more, and it's not hard in the sense of it's not doable. It's hard because ultimately at the end of the 6 months of how much you're juggling, how sleep deprived you are, can you still continue to do what you're being asked to do with everything that you know that's going on around you? And when I got down to the farm, one of my first things I did is I took a sticky note and I wrote one word on it and I slammed it onto my mirror in my bathroom, so that every morning I woke up, I saw this when I was getting ready, when I walked out the door, when I came back into my room at night. And that one word was relentless, because I wanted to remind myself that no matter how bad things get, no matter how tired I am, no matter how difficult things may be, I need to continue to push, because there is a reason why I'm doing this. There is, in my view, there is evil in the world. I've unfortunately seen it. I've also seen good, and I know what good people all are called to do to defeat evil. I know why I was in that role. And I had to remind myself to be relentless in my pursuit of why I was doing this, to accomplish this goal. But that word has since taken on a whole new meaning for me in my walk with God, because I left the agency and I'm no longer there, I'm not dealing with counterterrorism operations or counter proliferation or what have you. That doesn't mean that evil stops. And that doesn't mean that I can stop in my pursuit of godliness, in my pursuit of raising my children correctly, to walk in the fear of the Lord. It doesn't mean that I can give up on my community. It means that every day, day in, day out, we get up and we fight and we continue to walk by faith, regardless of what happens, no matter how hard it gets, because I am called to be relentless. And that experience down at the farm showed me what I'm capable of and reminds me that I I still have a lot more to give. And I have to continue to be relentless in that pursuit. So.
Hmm. So now that you're not in the CIA and you're working essentially for Google, can you tell me more about on a more practical application, maybe scale, how are you currently being relentless in your faith? What are some of the things that you do to make sure that you don't put faith on the back burner?
Yeah, that's a struggle, right? Our lives are busy. I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm an athlete, I'm a hacker. There's we all wear multiple roles, and they all clamor for time in the day. And so I've been very blessed that everywhere that I have gone in my career, God has brought godly men around me, to encourage, to bolster, to walk this journey with me. At the agency, it was Will. At the first employer where I was at before I came to Mandiant Google, I was surrounded by wonderful Christian men, and I mean we would have those conversations day in and day out of just what God is doing in the world, right? Being able to be open about my faith has just been such a blessing. And now at Mandiant, I'm so blessed because uh, three other men on my team have reached out, and we formed 3 days a week a Bible study, where in the morning before the workday begins, we get together and we're working through a chronological reading of the Bible. Before that, I actually walked them through a series on postmodernism that I put together. Um, in my personal life, I've started a group with Will, actually, and two other men, that meets on a biweekly basis, where we are pushing each other to go deeper in our walks, to ask hard questions, and to not just settle for easy answers. And so, on a practical level, I try to surround myself with godly Christian men. Try to identify those. Sometimes it's not always possible, but I would wager more often than not, there's probably someone in life or on people's teams, that you can walk with, to encourage, to bolster, to reach out to. Those conversations, I had one just this morning actually, is so fulfilling because it gets me out of focusing on just myself and my own walk, and helping to encourage and bolster other people on their walks as well. And that's actually been the thing that's been most fruitful for me, I think, in the most practical day-to-day aspect, is just finding those people and being able to reach out and just say, how are you doing? Because it often gets me off of my own struggles, and allows me to try to minister to those around me.
Hmm.
I don't know if that answers the question.
Absolutely. Well, isn't it interesting how even though we might not feel fully capable of teaching others about faith, the more we do it, the more strong we become in our own faith by pouring into others. And I see that in you, Christian, as you're talking, you're such a servant in to those around you. It sounds like you really spend a lot of time making sure that everyone else in your life is taken care of. And I think that's really, really beautiful. And I'm just, you mentioned this thing of postmodernism, and that was something that I know you had mentioned wanting to talk a little bit about how postmodernism has impacted us as believers. Would you mind talking about that a little bit more?
Yeah, that's a good one. How much time do we have?
I know, right?
I'll see what I can do. I put together like a 6 week series on it, so I'll see what I can do in five
Yeah,
minutes.
I know.
So I was very fortunate in that my church reached out to me and said, "Hey, do you want to teach a Sunday school session on just something that you consider a threat to the church? Like what is a threat that the modern church is facing?" And something stuck in my head from a different Sunday school series that one of my elders had walked through, and it was a one-off comment, and it was a study from the Barna Group in 2017, which was talking about worldviews and the worldviews that modern American Christians tend to hold. And one of the things that was shocking me was I forget what the exact statistic was, but it was something like more than 50% of Christians would acknowledge or agree with statements that resonate with postmodernism. And I was really confused by that because I was like, okay, I don't know what is postmodernism. And so I started digging into it. And the more I dug into it, the more horrified I became. um, because in my opinion, postmodernism explains most, if not all, of the struggles that we in the modern American society are actually struggling with right now. To put it in a nutshell, postmodernism came about in the 1950s, post World War II, which was grappling with the effects of what they called modernism, which is essentially that science and technology and logic and reasoning, which underpins pretty much all of Western thought, was to blame for the atrocities of World War I and World War II. Basically, World War I, World War II, we saw the rise of efficient death, the efficient methods and mechanisms of destruction of life, and that came about because of logic, reason, science, and technology. And so they started to question those underpinnings. And ultimately, what that gave rise to, because this is born out of Marxism, is that truth is relative and that meaning is dependent on the eye of the beholder. And what that ultimately gave rise to, once truth was toppled as not something that's objective and outside of ourselves, but is something that is subjective to what you and I perceive, well, then anything can become true. Anything goes. No one has a basis for telling anyone else that they have broken any sort of law or anything to appeal higher to, because there's nothing higher than man in that case. It destroys meaning, and ultimately gave rise to the idea that we can deconstruct things such as the church or the Bible or faith and rebuild it into something that is more akin to what we are looking for. And this is where you have the rise of um, basically that faith is something that is something of myself, right? And more often than not, when a Christian deconstructs or embraces relativism, what they reconstruct to, if they reconstruct at all, is something that looks more closely aligned to the culture of the world than it does to biblical Christian orthodoxy. And so it's I could go on for a lot longer, but um, I'm more convinced than ever that because we are living right now through the products of postmodernism. Most of your academic elites now would say that we're in a postmodern or something akin to that, but culture lags behind academia. And so while postmodernism arose in academia in the 1950s, all of the culture producers, so Hollywood, music, arts, whatever, even many of our politicians, right, who grew up through the academics of the 1950s, 1960s, they came up through this postmodernist, lack of a better word, indoctrination. And so they are now the culture producers in our world. And so while academics might say we're in a postmodern world, we are living right now through the products of the thought of postmodernism. Um, that's a lot of philosophy, I know.
No, it makes complete sense, Christian. And one of the things that I appreciate about how you're sharing everything that you're talking about today is just you have this way with words of taking something that sounds a little bit confusing and making it very simple. And correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm hearing is that we have gotten into this scary space where we've been saying, you believe what you want to believe, I'll believe what I want to believe. I get to come up with my own truth, and you do you, I do me. There is no true truth out there. Everyone is entitled to believe in their own truth. And that's where our society has become so scary, because nothing is true. We're told that nothing is truly true. Now, see, I'm making this so more complicated than
No, you're doing good.
But it's terrifying, because when we look at the Bible and what as Christians we're taught to be true, if we are, even as Christians, starting to deconstruct that and say, I might believe in the Bible, but it's okay if you believe in a different version of whatever you've created the Bible to be for you, we start going down this really terrifying path of anything goes. And it makes me think of that one movie I wish I had never seen. It was about, I can't even remember what the title of it is, but it's like there's a night where law enforcement goes away and anyone can do anything they want for 24 hours. And so people are like killing people, and like, do you know what I'm talking about? There's
I
a
think
movie out there.
isn't that called The Purge or something?
Yes, The Purge.
Is that what it is?
Yeah.
I never saw it.
No, good. Don't see it. It's funny. I don't let myself watch scary movies anymore, because I realize what it does to my brain is not good. When I was in high school, I would, say, let's get together and watch a scary movie. And I'm like, I can't handle it now. But that's what I thought of when you're talking about like anything goes. And it's a terrifying world we live in.
And ultimately, not to cut you off, this goes even to something that's as benign as, well, on where you said, as something like The Office, right? There's a scene in The Office where Jim and Pam are having to go through counseling, and the counselor tells them to speak their truth. And so the entire episode, they're relating to each other and saying, well, to speak my truth, that hurt my feelings, or to speak my truth, you should have thicker skin or something, right? And it's exactly what you're talking about, because ultimately what this gives rise to, in thinking about ethics, right, is John Stuart Mills had an ethics that was based on, well, as long as it feels good and doesn't do anybody any harm, then it's morally good. And that ultimately what that comes down to is hedonism, right? And we live in a society where as long as it feels good and it's not hurting anybody else, who are you to tell me that I can't do it? And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, Jesus is unambiguous about truth. He says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Jesus made himself synonymous with truth, to the point that when Pilate was scoffing at Jesus, and Jesus says, I came to bear witness to the truth, and Pilate says, what is truth? Jesus quite literally could have responded to him and said, me. Jesus is the truth. To say that there is no such thing as truth is literally to deny the deity of Christ. It's a terrifying thing, because it seems benign to a certain extent. It seems like, okay, well, fine, speak your truth. You do you, boo, right? And that's actually not biblical. And we live in a society that has started with the premise of you do you. And this is where we've ended up. It's a slippery slope. Once truth goes out the window, then we have no higher authority to appeal to.
Well, and I think
it leads to a lot of problems.
Sorry, now I cut you off. As you're talking about that, I think of it as it on the surface level, it seems loving to say you do you. It seems like a gesture of love, but that disregards something like the 10 Commandments, as you do you, seemingly like I'm telling you can do whatever you want. Again, to your point, as long as it's not harming anyone else. It seems like a positive thing in our culture when in
Yeah.
reality, under the surface, if we're not sharing with people the love of God and the 10 commandments and why God is commanding us to live our lives in a certain way, it can really become a tough, slippery slope.
100%. We have been told that the most loving thing we can do by our culture is to be tolerant. And that is actually, and this is going to sound weird, that is actually the most unloving thing that we can do. Because if we truly loved someone, we would not want them to spend eternity away from God. The most hateful thing that we can do is to shut up and not speak the truth. That is the most hateful thing we can do. The most loving thing we can do is to tell somebody in love what the truth is. The truth being, we are all fallen short of the glory of God. None of us deserve the gift of grace. And yet Christ, or God, in his mercy, extended grace to us. That doesn't give us carte blanche to do whatever we want. In fact, it's quite the opposite. We, out of love for him, abide by what he's commanded. The most hateful thing we can do is to shut up and tell someone else, you do you, boo.
You do you, boo. I think that's maybe the new title for our episode, but
That's right.
Okay, so Christian, I don't even know why I told you that we would probably be done in a certain amount of time, because you and I could truly, I think we could riff on this topic for another hour or two.
Part two.
Yeah, I think we might need to do a part two, Christian. I've never recommended that to a podcast guest before, but I'm really feeling that today.
Sure, I'm down for a part two.
And I think our audience probably is maybe going to be left with some lingering thoughts or questions that if we were to go a little bit deeper into this in a second digestible episode, that maybe we could do that as well. So I think maybe as we look to close our part one of our two-part episode, what can our listeners take away today? Any tips or advice on maybe if they're struggling to search for truth and they're struggling to stay relentless in their faith, what advice do you have?
Oh, that's a good question. I guess the first one, and this is born out of me being a CMO, collections management officer. Ask questions. God is not afraid of your questions. God invites you to ask your questions. He wants you to be engaged in finding truth because he is truth. Your search for answers is ultimately a search for him. Ask questions. Keep asking questions. There is an answer. The second thing is find good resources that push you deeper. And so, not to put a plug for someone else's podcast, but I'm going to highly recommend the Just Thinking podcast. Daryl Harrison, Virgil Walker. Those are long form, 2 to 3 hour podcasts that dive deep into topics like deconstructionism, like liberation theology, other things like that. That has been a resource that has pushed me deeper. And then the third thing is talk with your colleagues. I would hazard a guess, more often than not, there are other believers in your organization who are feeling like an island on their own. You're not alone. It's going to sound cliche, but be bold. Reasonably, you don't want to unnecessarily rock boats, but I would hazard a guess there are other believers in your organization who are feeling like an island that could use encouragement. So those three things: ask questions, find a good resource, and look for other believers around you, because I would hazard a guess they're there.
That's so good. I think more often than not, to your point, there are Christians around us in our circle. And the second that I've noticed that I say something about my Christian faith, usually someone else in the room lights up, and you didn't even realize that there was an opportunity to connect with another fellow believer in the room until you were courageous enough to mention something about your faith. So
Yeah,
I
you gave them
agree.
permission.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with that, Christian. And I'm so excited we're going to do a part two. I think this is going to
Yeah,
be really good. I think our listeners, like I said, are probably really enjoying the knowledge that you have and hearing about your background. And so I just thank you for your time today. And I'm excited for us to continue our conversation.
absolutely. Kelsey, thank you. This has been a lot of fun, and I hope that the information was useful for your listeners. And yeah, definitely let's do part two. And if they have any questions or anything that we can follow up on in addition to what we already have planned out, I'd be happy to take those on.
Awesome.